The evening air was cool and crisp as Officer Daniel Cooper drove his patrol car through the quiet streets of Millbrook. His partner Rex sat in the back seat with his nose pressed against the window, watching the world pass by. Rex was a German shepherd who had been working with Daniel for 4 years now, and they knew each other better than most human partners did. The town was small and peaceful with tree-lined streets and modest homes where people knew their neighbors and crime was rare. Daniel had grown up in Millbrook and joined the police department 8 years ago because he wanted to protect the place he called home. Most nights were uneventful with the occasional noise complaint or suspicious vehicle report, but nothing that kept him awake at night. His daughter Sophie was 10 years old and lived with him after his divorce 3 years ago, and he always made sure to be home in time to tuck her in when he worked the evening shift. Tonight felt like any other October evening with leaves scattered. Across the roads and porch lights glowing warmly in the gathering darkness, Rex suddenly stood up in the back seat and began whining in a way Daniel had never heard before. The dog's ears were pointed straight up and his whole body was tense with attention, focused on something outside. Daniel slowed the patrol car and looked around trying to see what had caught Rex's attention, but everything appeared normal. The houses were quiet and the streets were empty except for a few parked cars. Rex pressed his nose against the window and let out a low whine that sounded almost worried. Daniel had learned to trust his partner's instincts over the years because dogs could sense things humans missed. Rex had found missing children, tracked suspects through dense woods, and detected drugs hidden in clever places. This behavior was different, though, because Rex wasn't alerting to danger or giving his usual signals. He seemed confused and anxious, as if something he couldn't understand was bothering him. Daniel pulled over to the curb on Maple Street and turned to look at Rex. The dog was staring at a small house with faded blue paint and an overgrown lawn. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side with the name Harrison barely visible in peeling letters. Daniel recognized the house as belonging to George Harrison, an elderly veteran who kept to himself and rarely came outside. He had seen the old man a few times over the years, usually collecting his mail or putting out trash, but they had never really spoken beyond a polite greeting. The house looked dark and quiet with thick curtains covering all the windows and weeds growing tall around the foundation. Daniel opened the back door and let Rex out on his leash, expecting the dog to calm down once he could investigate properly. Instead, Rex pulled hard toward the house with his nose to the ground, following some invisible trail. They walked up the cracked driveway past a rusty old car that probably hadn't been driven in years. Rex led him around the side of the house where an old radio antenna stood among the tall grass and weeds. The antenna was ancient and looked like something from decades ago with weathered metal and frayed wires. Rex stopped at a basement window and sat down hard, pawing at the ground and whining more insistently. Daniel knelt beside him and looked through the dirty window into the basement below. What he saw made him pause because a strange blue light was pulsing down there in a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. It wasn't the normal glow of a television or computer screen, because the color was too intense and too pure. The light seemed to pulse with a pattern that was almost hypnotic, and Daniel found himself staring at it, trying to figure out what could produce such an unusual effect. He stood up and walked to the front door, wondering if he should call this in or just knock and ask if everything was okay. Rex followed close beside him, still anxious and alert in a way that made Daniel's instincts kick in. Something was definitely unusual here, even if he couldn't identify what it was. He knocked firmly on the door and called out his identification. "Officer Cooper from Millbrook Police Department, is everything all right?" There was a long silence and Daniel knocked again, louder this time. He heard slow shuffling footsteps from inside and then the sound of locks being undone. The door opened just a crack and an elderly man peered out with suspicious eyes. George Harrison looked thin and frail with silver hair and a face lined with age. He wore an old military jacket with faded patches, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the door. His gray eyes were sharp, though, and held a mixture of surprise and worry as he looked from Daniel to Rex and back again. "Is something wrong, officer?" he asked in a raspy but clear voice. Daniel explained that his K-9 partner had detected something unusual coming from the property and asked if he could ask a few questions. George's expression changed from worry to something that looked like resignation. He glanced at Rex, who was still focused intently on the house, then looked back at Daniel with a long, measuring stare. After what felt like forever, George opened the door wider and stepped aside. "I suppose it was only a matter of time," he said quietly. "You better come in, Officer Cooper, because what I'm about to show you is something you won't believe at first." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine as he followed the old man inside with Rex staying close to his leg. The living room was cluttered with old furniture and the walls were covered with photographs and military commendations from the Korean War. George moved slowly toward a doorway at the back of the room and gestured for Daniel to follow. They descended a narrow staircase into the basement, where that strange blue light grew brighter with each step. Daniel's hand moved instinctively near his radio, but something told him this wasn't a normal threat. Whatever was happening here was something different, and his world was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Within a week, the quiet town of Millbrook began to see subtle changes that most residents didn't notice, but Daniel watched with growing concern. Unmarked government vehicles appeared on streets near George's house, and men in plain clothes took up positions that looked casual, but were clearly surveillance. Paul had made contact with his sources at NASA and the Department of Defense, and apparently word had traveled fast through certain channels. Daniel knew they were being watched and evaluated, and he worried about how George would handle the pressure. He visited the old veteran every evening after his shift to check on him and make sure he wasn't being harassed or intimidated. George seemed surprisingly calm about the attention and told Daniel he had expected this kind of response once the truth started spreading. "I've had 63 years to prepare for this moment," he said with a slight smile. "Let them watch and investigate, because the more they look, the more they'll realize. I've been telling the truth all along." The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Daniel received a call from Paul asking him to bring George to a secure meeting location. "There are people who need to talk to him face to face," Paul said. "Scientists from 3 different agencies and some military intelligence officers who specialize in unusual phenomena. They've analyzed the data, and they want to verify the device and hear George's story directly." Daniel felt both excited and nervous as he drove to George's house to deliver the news. The old man took it in stride and simply asked for an hour to clean up and gather some additional documentation. They loaded boxes of files and equipment into Daniel's personal truck and drove to an address Paul had provided on the outskirts of town. The location turned out to be a small office building that had been rented and converted into a temporary secure facility, complete with guards at the entrance and electronic scanning equipment. Inside, they were met by a group of serious-looking people who introduced themselves with names and credentials that Daniel barely absorbed. There were astrophysicists from NASA, engineers from defense contractors, and military officers with impressive ranks and security clearances. They treated George with cautious respect, asking him to explain his story from the beginning while recording everything. George sat at a conference table with Daniel beside him and spent 3 hours walking through his history with the Viridians. He showed them his original journal from 1962 and explained how he had first detected the signal and spent years learning to decode it. He described his decades of communication with the Viridian Collective and their reasons for monitoring humanity. He explained the warning about the harvesters and provided all the technical data they had sent him about the approaching threat. The scientists asked hundreds of questions, drilling into technical details and mathematical concepts that made Daniel's head spin. George answered everything he could and admitted freely when something was beyond his understanding. "I'm just the messenger," he said at one point. "I've done my best to understand and translate what they've shared with me, but I'm not a physicist or an engineer. What I can tell you is that the Viridians have been honest with me for over 60 years, and when they say humanity is in danger, I believe them completely." The group took a break for lunch, and Daniel overheard several of the scientists talking in hushed, excited tones. One of them, a woman named Dr. Laura Kim, was saying that the mathematics in George's documents matched theoretical models for quantum entanglement communication that were only recently published. "This isn't just advanced technology," she said. "This is proof that those theories actually work in practice, and that's worth almost as much as the warning itself." After lunch, the group moved to a converted garage behind the building where George's crystalline device had been carefully transported and set up. The scientists crowded around it, taking measurements with sophisticated equipment and photographing it from every angle. George powered it up and demonstrated how it worked, showing them how he could send a message and receive a response from the Viridians. The device pulsed with its characteristic blue light, and the scientists watched their instruments in stunned silence. One of the engineers, a man named Stephen Clark, turned to his colleagues with wide eyes and said the quantum fluctuations we're measuring shouldn't be possible with any technology we've developed. This thing is manipulating space-time in ways that violate everything we thought we knew about the limits of physics. George sent a message to the Viridians explaining that representatives from Earth's scientific and military communities were now aware of the situation and were beginning to take the threat seriously. The response came within minutes, translated by George's computer into English. The Viridians expressed relief that humanity was finally being warned properly and offered to provide additional technical support and data. They explained that while their laws prevented them from directly intervening in the affairs of developing civilizations, they could share information and knowledge that might help humanity defend itself. The message also included updated trajectory calculations for the harvesters, showing that the threat was still approximately 5.5 months away. The scientists in the room fell silent as they read the translation, and the weight of the situation settled over everyone like a heavy blanket. Dr. Kim stepped forward and addressed George directly. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "I think I speak for everyone here when I say we believe you and we're going to do everything in our power to help. But we need to move quickly, because 5.5 months is not a lot of time to develop defenses against something like this. We need to bring in more people, expand our research teams, and start working with international partners. This isn't just an American problem, it's a threat to the entire planet." George nodded and said he would cooperate fully with whatever they needed. Daniel felt a surge of pride in the old veteran who had carried this burden alone for so long, and was now finally being taken seriously. The meeting continued for several more hours with plans being made for expanded research facilities and protocols for ongoing communication with the Viridians. As the sun was setting, Daniel and George were finally allowed to leave with instructions to return the next day for more consultations. They drove back to Millbrook in tired silence, and Daniel helped George carry his boxes back into the house. The old man looked exhausted but also relieved, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you for believing in me, Officer Cooper," he said as Daniel prepared to leave. "I know this has turned your life upside down, and I'm sorry for dragging you into something this big." Daniel shook his head and smiled. "You didn't drag me into anything," he said. "Rex led me to your door, and I made the choice to listen and help. Whatever happens next, we're in this together." He drove home thinking about the coming months and wondering how much the world would change once the full truth became public knowledge. For now, it was still a secret shared by a small group of people, but Daniel knew that wouldn't last long, and soon everyone would know that humanity was not alone in the universe and that something terrible was heading their way. Daniel felt his mouth go dry as he stared at the screens filled with data he couldn't begin to understand. 6 months to warn humanity about an alien threat sounded like something from a movie, not something happening in a basement in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. George sat back down in his chair and pulled up more files on the computer, showing charts and diagrams that looked like they came from an advanced astronomy program. "The Viridians have been tracking this thing for years," George explained as he pointed at various elements on the screen. "They call it the harvesters because that's what it does. It moves from star system to star system, consuming every resource it can find, including planets and any life forms that happen to be in the way. It's not a natural phenomenon, and it's not a living species in the traditional sense. It's an artificial intelligence that was created millions of years ago by a civilization that no longer exists, and it's been wandering the galaxy ever since, following a program to gather resources and expand." Daniel leaned forward to look more closely at the data, trying to make sense of the numbers and symbols. "How do they know it's coming here?" he asked. George opened another file that showed what looked like trajectory calculations and probability models. "They've been monitoring its movements for centuries," he said. "The harvesters follow a pattern moving from one star system to the next, based on resource availability and other factors they've analyzed. 3 days ago, their calculations confirmed that our solar system is next on its path, and it's already started accelerating toward us. According to their estimates, it will reach the outer edges of our solar system in approximately 6 months. And once it arrives, we won't have much time to react. The Viridians encountered the harvesters about 800 years ago and barely escaped with enough of their civilization intact to rebuild. They've been tracking it ever since, hoping to warn other species before it's too late." Daniel stood up and paced the small basement, trying to organize his thoughts. This was beyond anything in his training or experience, but he couldn't just walk away and pretend he hadn't seen this. If there was even a small chance George was telling the truth, then the stakes were too high to ignore. "What exactly did they send you?" he asked. turning back to George. The old man pulled out a thick folder filled with printed documents and handed it to Daniel. Everything they could give me, George said. Technical specifications about the harvesters, including its size composition and capabilities. Information about how it attacks and consumes resources. Data about defensive technologies that might work against it. Coordinates and astronomical data so we can verify its approach using our own telescopes. They've given me everything they're allowed to share under their rules about non-interference. Daniel opened the folder and flipped through pages covered in equations, diagrams, and dense technical writing. Some of it was in English translated by George, but much of it was in the mathematical language the Viridians used. Have you tried to contact anyone about this? Daniel asked. George let out a bitter laugh and shook his head. I've tried for years, he said. Not about the harvesters because I only learned about that 3 days ago, but about the Viridians in general. I've sent letters to universities, government agencies, military contacts, and scientific organizations. I've made phone calls, written emails, and even tried to arrange meetings. Every single time I was dismissed as a crazy old man or a hoaxer looking for attention. A few people were polite about it, but most just hung up or threw away my letters. After a while, I stopped trying because I realized no one would believe me. Without proof, and the only proof I have is in this basement. Rex had been lying, quietly near the crystalline device, but suddenly stood up and walked over to Daniel, pressing against his leg. The dog looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes as if urging him to take this seriously. Daniel reached down and scratched Rex behind the ears, thinking about what to do next. Your dog sensed the quantum signature of the device, George said, watching them. Animals are more sensitive to certain frequencies and energy patterns than humans are. That's why he led you here. And that's why I think this meeting was meant to happen. The Viridians told me that someone would come eventually, and someone who could help spread the warning. Maybe your dog was the key to making that happen. Daniel looked at the pulsing blue device and made a decision that would change his life forever. Mr. Harrison, he said, I believe you and I'm going to help you. I don't understand all of this, and I'm sure I'll have a lot more questions. But we need to find a way to get this information to people who can do something about it. People with resources and authority, and the ability to verify what you're telling me. George's eyes filled with tears and he nodded slowly. Thank you, Officer Cooper, he said. I've been carrying this burden alone for so long, and I was starting to think I would die before anyone believed me. Daniel pulled out his phone and thought about who he could trust with this information. He couldn't just call his sergeant and explain what he had found, because she would think he had lost his mind. He needed to be strategic and careful about how he approached this. I have a friend from college, Daniel said. His name is Paul Martinez, and he works as a researcher at a private aerospace company. He's smart and open-minded, and he has connections to people in the scientific community who might be able to help. Let me reach out to him first and see if I can get him to look at some of this evidence. George nodded and began organizing the most compelling documents and data files. They spent the next 2 hours going through everything, with George explaining the key points and Daniel taking notes. The crystalline device continued to pulse with its steady blue light, and Rex stayed close by as if standing guard over something precious. By the time Daniel left the house, it was nearly midnight, and his mind was spinning with everything he had learned. He sat in his patrol car for several minutes, just breathing and trying to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. He drove home slowly, thinking about his daughter Sophie and the world she would inherit. If George was right, then humanity had 6 months to prepare for a threat unlike anything it had ever faced. 6 months to believe in something impossible and find a way to defend against it. Daniel parked in his driveway and looked up at the stars scattered across the clear October sky. Somewhere out there, 40 light-years away, an alien civilization was watching and trying to help. And somewhere else in the vast darkness between stars, an ancient machine was moving toward Earth with cold mechanical purpose. Tomorrow he would start making calls and sending messages, but tonight he just wanted to hold his daughter and pretend for a few more hours that the world was still simple and safe. The night before the harvesters were expected to reach the outer solar system, Daniel couldn't sleep, so he drove to the research facility, where George was still awake in his quarters. The old veteran was sitting by his window looking up at the stars, and he smiled when Daniel knocked and entered. I knew you'd come by tonight, he said. Neither of us could stay away, could we? They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, just two men who had been brought together by impossible circumstances and had become true friends. George's device was in the next room, still pulsing with its blue light, as the Viridian sent final messages of encouragement and technical advice. The atmosphere at the facility was tense but determined, with scientists and military personnel monitoring systems and running final checks on the orbital weapons network. Humanity had done everything it could in the time available, and now all anyone could do was wait and see if it would be enough. The harvesters entered the detection range of Earth's most powerful telescopes just after dawn, and the images were transmitted to command centers around the world. Daniel watched the footage on screens in the facility's main operations room and felt his blood run cold. The things looked exactly as the Viridians had described, but seeing them was different from reading technical specifications. They were massive, irregular structures that seemed to shift and reconfigure as they moved with surfaces that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. There were 3 of them traveling in a loose formation, and they were heading directly toward the inner solar system. Scientists estimated they would reach Earth's orbit in approximately 18 hours. An analysis of their energy signatures confirmed they were powering up their harvesting systems in preparation for resource extraction. George stood beside Daniel, watching the screens with a calm expression that seemed almost serene. "This is really happening," he said quietly. "After all these years of warnings and preparations, we're finally face to face with the threat." Daniel put a hand on the old man's shoulder and said, "We're ready because of you. If you hadn't spent decades communicating with the Viridians, and if you hadn't been willing to share your secret, we would have had no warning at all. Humanity owes you more than we can ever repay." George shook his head and replied, "I'm just one person who happened to find a signal. The real heroes are all the people who believed and worked together to build our defenses. This victory, if we achieve one, will belong to all of humanity." The weapons platforms in orbit were activated 8 hours before the expected engagement with crews, running final systems checks and locking in targeting solutions. Paul Martinez was at the main command center, coordinating between different national space agencies and military commands. He called Daniel to give him updates, and his voice was tight with tension, but also with determination. "We're as ready as we're ever going to be," he said. "The platforms are armed and powered, and we have backup systems in place if the primary weapons fail. The targeting computers have been programmed with all the data the Viridians provided about weak points in the harvester structure. We're going to hit them with everything we have as soon as they come into range, and we're not going to stop until either they're destroyed or we run out of ammunition." The engagement began when the harvesters crossed the orbit of Mars and entered the range of humanity's longest-distance weapons. The first energy pulses lit up the darkness of space like artificial stars, and the operations room erupted in controlled chaos as operators called out firing solutions and damage assessments. Daniel watched the tactical displays showing the battle unfold in real time, with markers representing the harvesters and the web of orbital platforms surrounding Earth. The energy weapons struck their targets with devastating force, and for a moment there was hope as sensors detected significant damage to one of the harvester's outer structures. But the machines adapted quickly, deploying shields and repair systems that began compensating for the damage even as more weapons fire poured into them. The battle lasted for 6 hours, with humanity throwing everything it had at the approaching threat. Some weapons platforms were destroyed by return fire from the harvesters, but others kept firing, with crews showing remarkable courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The Viridians sent constant updates through George's device, providing real-time analysis of the harvester's status and suggesting targeting adjustments. Their help proved invaluable because human sensors couldn't penetrate the shields as effectively as Viridian technology. Slowly but steadily, the concentrated fire began to have an effect, with 2 of the harvesters showing critical system failures. Their shields started to flicker and their movement became erratic as power systems were damaged beyond their ability to repair. The third harvester proved more resilient and continued advancing toward Earth despite taking tremendous damage. Paul's voice came over the communication system saying, "We're running low on ammunition and power reserves. If we don't stop this last one in the next hour, it's going to reach planetary orbit and we won't be able to prevent it from beginning its harvesting operations." Daniel felt his heart sink as he realized they might have come so far only to fail at the last moment. But then George stood up and walked to his device with sudden purpose. The old veteran sat down at his console and began typing frantically. "I'm asking the Viridians if there's anything else they can do," he said. "Any last option they haven't told us about." The device pulsed with unusual intensity and then displayed a message that made George's eyes widen. "They say there is one thing they can do without violating their rules of non-interference, but it requires our explicit consent and understanding of the risks the message explained that the Viridians could generate a focused gravitational pulse from their observation, ships that would destabilize the remaining Harvester's power core. The pulse wouldn't destroy the machine directly, but it would create conditions where humanity's remaining weapons would be far more effective. The risk was that the gravitational pulse might also affect Earth's orbit and tidal systems in unpredictable ways, with potential long-term consequences. George looked at Daniel and then at the screen showing the advancing Harvester. "We don't have much choice, do we?" he said. Daniel shook his head and said, "No, we don't. Tell them we accept the risks and we give our consent." George transmitted humanity's response, and within minutes the Viridian ships moved into position. The gravitational pulse was invisible to human sensors, but its effects were immediately apparent. The Harvester's shields collapsed completely and its structure began to buckle under forces it couldn't compensate for. Humanity's remaining weapons poured fire into the exposed core, and finally, the ancient machine's power systems went critical. It exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the solar system, and when the sensors cleared, there was nothing left but debris. The operations room fell silent for a long moment and then erupted in cheers and tears of relief. Daniel pulled George into a hug and the old man laughed with joy and exhaustion. "We did it," he said. "Humanity stood together and we survived." The Viridians sent a final message congratulating Earth on its victory and formally inviting humanity to join the community of spacefaring civilizations. They explained that the gravitational pulse had only caused minor temporary effects on Earth's orbit that would correct themselves within a few years. More importantly, they said that humanity had proven itself worthy of contact through its courage, unity, and determination. The age of isolation was over, and Earth's future among the stars was just beginning. In the days that followed, the world celebrated its survival and mourned the brave crews who had been lost in the battle. George Harrison was honored as a hero and statesman, with leaders from every nation coming to Millbrook to thank him personally. Daniel returned to his normal life as much as possible, but knew nothing would ever really be normal again. He spent evenings with Sophie, telling her stories about the battle and the future that was opening up for humanity. Rex stayed close as always, and Daniel often thought about how everything had started with his partner's unusual behavior on a quiet October evening. The discovery in George's basement had indeed shaken the entire town, and then the entire world, but more than that, it had transformed humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. The officer and his K-9 had stumbled onto something impossible, and in doing so had given their species a chance to survive and thrive among the stars. The world changed rapidly once the truth became public, and the transformation was both inspiring and chaotic. Within a month of the story breaking, the United Nations convened an emergency assembly where representatives from every nation gathered to discuss the threat and coordinate a global response. George was invited to address the assembly via video link because he was too frail to travel, and Daniel stood beside him in the specially prepared room as the old veteran explained to the world's leaders what he knew about the Harvesters. George spoke clearly and simply, describing the threat in terms anyone could understand and sharing the technical data the Viridians had provided. When he finished, there was a moment of profound silence in the assembly hall, followed by the kind of serious discussion that rarely happened in international politics. Countries that had been rivals for decades suddenly found common ground, and resources that would normally be tied up in bureaucracy were released with unprecedented speed. The scientific community mobilized on a scale never seen before, with researchers from every nation contributing their expertise to the effort. Paul Martinez found himself coordinating teams of physicists, engineers, and computer scientists from 6 continents, all working on different aspects of the defensive systems needed to combat the Harvesters. The Viridians continued to provide guidance through George's device, and they proved remarkably patient with humanity's questions and requests for clarification. They sent detailed schematics for the energy weapons they had suggested, along with information about power generation systems and targeting computers far beyond current Earth technology. The challenge wasn't just building new weapons, but creating an entire infrastructure of manufacturing and testing facilities that could produce them in time. Private companies and government agencies worked together, sharing patents and trade secrets in ways that would have been unthinkable before the crisis. Millbrook became an unlikely center of this global effort, with George's house and the surrounding area transformed into a secure research facility. The government purchased several neighboring properties and built a modern complex around the original basement, where George's device remained in operation. The old veteran was given comfortable quarters in the new facility and a team of assistants to help him manage the communications with the Viridians. Daniel visited him every day and was amazed at how George had adapted to his new role as humanity's ambassador to an alien civilization. The man who had spent decades in isolation and secrecy was now surrounded by people who valued his knowledge and experience. He seemed to grow younger under the attention with a renewed sense of purpose that gave him energy despite his age. Daniel's own life had changed dramatically as well. He was promoted to serve as a liaison between the research facility and local law enforcement, with responsibility for security and community relations. Linda became his deputy, and together they managed the complex task of keeping Millbrook functioning normally while hosting one of the most important sites on Earth. Sophie adjusted to having a father who was suddenly involved in saving the world, and she became something of a hero at school, where her classmates were fascinated by her connection to the story. Rex remained Daniel's constant companion, and the dog seemed to understand that something important was happening. Scientists had studied Rex extensively, trying to understand how he had detected the quantum signature of George's device, and their research led to the development of new sensor technologies that might be useful in detecting the harvesters when they arrived. The months passed with terrifying speed as teams around the world raced to build the defensive systems. The first prototype energy weapon was tested in the Nevada desert 3 months after the public announcement, and the results were both promising and sobering. The weapon successfully generated the kind of focused quantum field the Viridians had described, but it required enormous amounts of power and could only fire for short bursts before needing to recharge. Engineers worked to improve the efficiency, while manufacturing facilities ramped up production. The plan was to build a network of orbital weapons platforms that could engage the harvesters as soon as they entered the solar system. Getting those platforms into space required a massive expansion of rocket launch capabilities, with private space companies working alongside government programs to achieve launch frequencies that had never been attempted before. International cooperation reached levels that seemed miraculous to anyone who remembered the conflicts and tensions of previous decades. Russia and the United States shared satellite data and launch facilities. China and Europe collaborated on manufacturing the complex components needed for the weapon systems. Nations that had barely spoken to each other were now sharing resources and expertise, because everyone understood that this threat didn't care about borders or politics. There were still disagreements and tensions, but they were minor compared to the overwhelming sense of shared purpose. Humanity was finally working together as a single species united by the need to survive. George watched all of this unfold with wonder, and told Daniel one evening that this unity was perhaps as important as the weapons being built. "The Viridians have been watching us for thousands of years," he said, "and they've seen us at our worst, fighting endless wars and destroying our own planet. But they've also seen our potential, and this response to the crisis is showing them what we can accomplish when we work together. Maybe that's why they chose to warn us, because they believed we were capable of rising to meet this challenge." The Viridians sent a message 4 months after the public announcement that brought both hope and increased urgency. They reported that the harvesters had been detected by long-range monitoring systems and were moving slightly faster than initially calculated. The revised timeline gave humanity approximately 6 weeks before the first contact, instead of the 2 months that had been expected. This news sent a wave of panic through the research teams, but also galvanized them to work even harder. Paul called Daniel in the middle of the night to explain that they were accelerating the deployment schedule and rushing the final weapons platforms into orbit. "We're not going to have time for all the testing we wanted," he said. "Some of these systems will be going into space without full validation, and we'll just have to hope they work when we need them. It's risky, but we don't have any choice. We either try with what we have or we give up, and that's not an option." Daniel spent more time with George during those final weeks, helping the old veteran manage the increasing demands on his time and energy. George was in constant communication with the Viridians, coordinating the final technical details and receiving updates on the harvester's approach. The alien civilization had moved several of their own ships into position to observe the confrontation, and they promised to document everything for their archives. They couldn't fight on humanity's behalf, but they could watch and record, And if humanity survived, they would welcome Earth into the community of spacefaring civilizations. George seemed at peace with whatever was coming, and he told Daniel one evening that he was grateful to have lived long enough to see humanity unite and fight for its future. "I've spent most of my life alone with a secret that I thought would die with me," he said. "But now everyone knows the truth and we're standing together against the darkness. Whatever happens next, I'm proud of what we've accomplished and I'm proud to have played a small part in it." The careful secrecy around George's discovery lasted less than 2 weeks before things started to spiral beyond anyone's control. Daniel arrived at the police station one morning to find his sergeant Linda Chen waiting for him with her arms crossed and a very serious expression on her face. "Her office now," she said, and closed the door behind them once they were inside. "Daniel, I've known you for 8 years and I've never questioned your judgment, but something strange is going on, and I need you to tell me what it is. Government agents have been asking questions about you and some elderly veteran on Maple Street, and there are surveillance teams parked all over that neighborhood. What exactly did you stumble into during your patrol 2 weeks ago?" Daniel had been dreading this conversation, but he also knew Linda well enough to trust her. She was smart, dedicated, and had always treated him fairly. He took a deep breath and made the decision to bring her into the secret. Over the next hour, he explained everything, from Rex's unusual behavior to the discovery of George's device to the meetings with scientists and government officials. Linda listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from skepticism to shock to something like awe. When Daniel finished, she sat quietly for several minutes, just processing what she had heard. "Let me get this straight," she finally said. "We have an 88-year-old veteran in our town who has been in contact with aliens for 63 years, and those aliens have warned us about some kind of ancient machine that's going to attack Earth in 5 months, and you've been keeping this quiet while working with government scientists to verify it." Daniel nodded and waited for her reaction. Linda stood up and paced her small office, running her hands through her hair. "This is insane," she said. "But the fact that government agents are swarming our town means there's something real happening here. I want to meet this George Harrison and see the evidence for myself." Daniel arranged for Linda to visit George's house that evening, and the old veteran welcomed her with the same patient dignity he had shown everyone else. He walked her through his story, showed her the device in operation, and let her read through his journals and documentation. Linda was thorough in her questioning, asking about details and timelines, and pressing George on anything that seemed inconsistent. After 3 hours, she finally sat back and shook her head in amazement. "I believe you," she said. "I don't understand most of the technical aspects, but the evidence is too compelling to dismiss. What do you need from me?" George smiled and said, "What we need is protection and support. The government people have been professional so far, but I'm worried about what happens when this becomes public knowledge. I'm an old man and I can't defend myself against mobs of reporters or conspiracy theorists or worse." Linda promised to work with Daniel to ensure George's safety and to help manage the situation in Millbrook as things developed. The secret began spreading through necessary channels as more scientists and government officials were brought in to work on the problem. Within 3 weeks, there were over 50 people actively involved in analyzing the threat and developing potential defensive strategies. The Viridians continued to provide information through George's device, including detailed specifications about the harvesters and suggestions for technologies that might be effective against it. They explained that the harvesters were massive constructs the size of small moons that could break apart planets to harvest their resources. They moved slowly, but were nearly indestructible, using advanced shielding and self-repair systems that made conventional weapons useless. The only way to stop them was to disrupt their core artificial intelligence or to damage their power generation systems badly enough that they couldn't continue operating. Paul Martinez became one of the key coordinators for the research effort, working with teams from NASA, the Department of Defense, and several private aerospace companies. He called Daniel regularly with updates, and the news was both encouraging and terrifying. "We're making progress," he said during one call. "The Viridians have given us blueprints for a type of energy weapon that might be able to penetrate the harvester's shields. But building it will require manufacturing techniques we've never attempted before. We're talking about focusing quantum energy fields in ways that sound more like magic than science. The engineering teams are working around the clock, but we're going to need more time and resources than we have." Daniel asked if there was any chance of getting help from other countries, and Paul said that was the next big step. "We can't keep this secret much longer," he said. "Too many people know, And the stakes are too high for national pride or politics. We need to go public soon and get the entire world working together on this. That moment came sooner than anyone expected, when a journalist from a major newspaper somehow got wind of the story and started asking questions. Daniel never found out who leaked the information, but suddenly there were reporters camped outside George's house and news vans parked on Maple Street. Linda called in extra officers to keep the peace and protect George from the media frenzy. The government tried to control the narrative, at first issuing carefully worded statements that confirmed unusual phenomena were being investigated, but providing few details. It didn't work because too many people had seen too much, and within 48 hours the full story was spreading across the internet and television news. George Harrison, elderly veteran, claims to have been in contact with aliens for 63 years and warns of impending threat to Earth. The headlines ranged from sensational to skeptical, but the key information was out there and the world was beginning to react. Daniel watched the news coverage with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Some people dismissed it as a hoax or mass delusion, but others took it seriously, especially after several respected scientists came forward to confirm they had examined the evidence and believed it was legitimate. Dr. Laura Kim gave an interview where she explained the mathematics behind the quantum communication device and showed data that couldn't be faked with current human technology. Stephen Clark appeared on a science program to discuss the energy signatures they had measured and why they indicated technology far beyond anything Earth could produce. The tide of public opinion began to shift as more experts vouched for George's claims and as the government released some of the data provided by the Viridians. World leaders started issuing statements calling for international cooperation, and emergency meetings were scheduled. At the United Nations, George handled the attention with remarkable grace considering his age and his decades of isolation. He gave several interviews, always staying calm and factual, and emphasizing that the Viridians wanted to help humanity survive. When reporters asked why the aliens hadn't made contact openly, George explained their rules about non-interference and their belief that civilizations needed to develop naturally without outside influence. The warning about the harvesters was an exception they made because the threat was existential, and time was too short for humanity to discover it on their own. Daniel stayed close to George during this period, acting as both protector and friend. Rex became something of a celebrity too, with reporters wanting to interview the dog who had first detected the alien signal. Daniel did his best to shield his daughter Sophie from the chaos, but she eventually figured out that her dad was involved in something important. She asked him one night if the alien stories were true, and Daniel decided to be honest with her. "Yes, sweetheart, they're true," he said, "and we're going to do everything we can to keep everyone safe." Sophie hugged him tightly and said she knew he would because he was the bravest person she knew, and Daniel hoped he could live up to that faith. Daniel woke up early the next morning after barely sleeping at all. His mind had been racing all night with images of that pulsing blue device and thoughts about alien threats heading toward Earth. He made breakfast for Sophie and tried to act normal, but his daughter noticed something was different. "You look tired, Dad," she said as she ate her cereal. "Did you have a hard night at work?" Daniel smiled and told her everything was fine, just some paperwork that kept him busy late. He dropped her off at school and then headed straight to the police station, trying to figure out how to approach what came next. He couldn't tell anyone at work about George and the Viridians yet because he needed more time to build a credible case. Instead, he focused on his normal duties and waited until his lunch break to make the call he had been thinking about all morning. Paul Martinez answered on the third ring, sounding cheerful and surprised. "Daniel Cooper, is that really you?" he said. "Man, I haven't heard from you in 3 years. How are you doing?" They exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes, catching up on life and family, before Daniel steered the conversation toward the real reason he had called. "Paul, listen," he said, "I need to talk to you about something strange, and I need you to keep an open mind. I know that sounds weird, but I promise this is serious." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Daniel could hear the curiosity in Paul's voice when he responded. "Okay, you've got my attention," he said. "What's going on?" Daniel took a deep breath and started explaining what he had found in George Harrison's basement. He kept the story straightforward and factual, describing the device, the journal, the transmissions, and the warning about the harvesters. He expected Paul to laugh or make a joke, but instead his old friend listened quietly without interrupting. When Daniel finished, there was a long silence, Finally, Paul spoke and his tone was serious and thoughtful. "That's quite a story," he said. "I'll be honest with you, Daniel. My first instinct is to think this old man is either confused or running an elaborate hoax. But you wouldn't be calling me if you weren't convinced there was something real here. What exactly do you need from me?" Daniel felt a wave of relief that Paul was at least willing to listen. "I need you to look at the evidence," he said. "George has documents, technical specifications, and recordings of the transmissions. He has data that he claims came from an alien civilization, and I need someone with your background to tell me if any of it is legitimate. Can you do that?" Paul agreed immediately, and they arranged for Daniel to send encrypted files that evening. "I'll look at everything with fresh eyes," Paul promised. "If there's something real here, I'll be able to tell, and I'll know who else to bring in to verify it." "But Daniel, if this turns out to be nothing, you owe me a very expensive dinner." "Deal," Daniel said, and ended the call, feeling like he had taken the first real step toward getting help. That evening, Daniel returned to George's house with a laptop and portable hard drive. The old man was waiting for him in the basement, surrounded by his equipment and looking more energized than he had the night before. "I've been organizing everything," George said, gesturing to stacks of folders and flash drives on the desk. "I've compiled the most important transmissions, the clearest technical data, and all of my notes from the past 63 years. This should be enough for your friend to make an initial assessment." They spent hours copying files and recording video of the device in operation. George even demonstrated how he could send and receive messages from the Viridians using the crystalline relay. He typed mathematical equations into his computer, and the device responded by pulsing in complex patterns. A few minutes later, it pulsed again, and George's computer displayed a response message translated into English. The Viridians were asking if George had made progress in finding someone to help with the warning. Daniel watched in amazement as George typed a reply, explaining that he had found an ally and was working to spread the information to people who could verify it. The device pulsed again, transmitting the message across 40 light-years of space at speeds that shouldn't be possible, according to everything Daniel knew about physics. "How does it work?" Daniel asked. "How can you send messages faster than light?" George smiled slightly and shook his head. "I only understand about 10% of the actual mechanism," he admitted. The Viridians tried to explain it using concepts from quantum physics and something they call dimensional folding. But most of it is beyond my ability to comprehend. What I do know is that the device creates a connection between 2 points in space, using entangled particles, and it can transmit information through that connection almost instantaneously. It's not exactly faster than light travel, but it's close enough for practical purposes. Daniel recorded everything on his phone, making sure to capture clear footage of the device operating and George explaining the technical details. When they finished, it was nearly midnight again, and Daniel had hours of video plus gigabytes of data files to send to Paul. He thanked George and promised to return as soon as he had news from his friend. The old man looked tired but hopeful as he walked Daniel to the door. "You're a good man, Officer Cooper," he said. "I've spent most of my life alone with this secret, and it means more than I can say to have someone believe me." Daniel drove home and spent another hour uploading the encrypted files to a secure server that Paul could access. He sent a message letting his friend know the data was ready, and then finally allowed himself to collapse into bed. 2 days later, Paul called back and his voice was shaking with excitement and disbelief. "Daniel, you need to sit down for this," he said. "I've been going through the files you sent, and I brought in 2 colleagues I trust completely to help me analyze the technical data. We've spent 48 hours straight looking at everything, and I'm telling you, this is real. The mathematics in those transmissions are beyond anything we could fake, and they reference concepts that are only theoretical in our current understanding of physics. The crystalline device, based on the video you sent, appears to be manipulating quantum states in ways we can barely measure, let alone reproduce. Either this is the most elaborate and sophisticated hoax in human history created by someone with knowledge decades ahead of public science, or your old veteran is telling the truth about alien contact." Daniel felt his heart pounding as Paul continued. "I've reached out to some contacts at NASA and the Department of Defense," he said. "I didn't tell them everything yet, but I said I had come across some unusual data that needed expert verification. They're interested and they want to see more. But Daniel, if we're going to take this further, we need to be prepared for what comes next. If the government gets involved, they might take over completely, and your friend George might lose control of his device and his life's work." Daniel thought about that carefully and then made another decision. George has been protecting this secret for 63 years, he said. If we're going to bring in the authorities, we do it on terms that respect him and his role in all of this. He's not a threat or a curiosity. He's humanity's first contact with an alien species, and he deserves to be treated with dignity. Paul agreed, and they began planning the next steps together, knowing that once they opened this door, there would be no going back.